الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيد الأنبياء والمرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. أما بعد، يقول الله عز وجل: ورسلا قد قصصناهم عليك من قبل ورسلا لم نقصصهم عليك وكلم الله موسى تكليما. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in this verse, to other messengers we have already mentioned to you, and also some we have not. And to Musa, Allah spoke directly. And this passage is very telling. And it shows us the station and the maqam and the position of our beloved messenger, Musa alayhi salatu wassalam. And as we have been talking about the different messengers in the past few weeks, there are certain things that stand out about Musa alayhi salam as an individual. And some of the shared characteristics he has with some of the other prophets and some of the other messengers alayhim salam. And one of the things that we find with him, that as we find with others, is difficulty and trial and tribulation, and his was a little different. He lived at a time where Pharaoh was executing and slaughtering all of the males. And some of the Israeliyat mention that he would do it in alternate years. Right? He didn't kill them every year, and the reason is that he needed more male slaves. So the year that his brother Harun was born, that was not a year that he was killing. In the year that Musa alayhi salam was born, that was the year that he was. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He inspired Musa alayhi salam's mother to put him in the river. So she put him, and she trusted Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to put him in this river. And out of all of the people who could have picked up this basket and this child, we find that it was Pharaoh's wife to be the one that picked him up. And it was in that home, and just imagine, the home of one of the most powerful human beings who were in existence that lived at that time. What kind of education, what kind of upbringing, what kind of food did he eat? What kind of people was he around? He was around statesmen, he was around wazirs and advisors, people who spoke in a political language, people who spoke in a very educated way. He ate well, he trained well. He understood this stepfather who was raising him. He understood his mentality. And if we looked back and we compared it to today, we would say he had a very privileged upbringing. And not just that, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He blessed him in other ways. He made him a strong young man. He made him a handsome young man. He made him someone who others looked up to. So just imagine, this young, handsome, well-spoken, well-fed, taken care of, skilled, graceful individual, alayhi salam. Then Allah took it all away. Right? It's very different starting in poverty. Right? It's very different. When we start in poverty and we have difficulty, when we move up and we face a little bit of difficulty, we'll look back and be like, oh, this wasn't as hard as that time. Or this wasn't as difficult at that time. Imagine not knowing poverty. Imagine not experiencing it. Imagine not knowing what it is and then being kicked out to fend on your own. Young, well-spoken, handsome, well-groomed, graceful, having nothing. It's very difficult, right? When we're on a pedestal or we're in a high place and then we fall from that space, how do we deal with it? There are certain things in our lives, maybe some of us, and alhamdulillah, Allah has privileged us all in different ways. But if someone just took away my car one day, I say, well, I don't know, how would I get around? I can't imagine life without a car. Someone might tell me, oh, you can take the bus. I'm like, what, there's a bus that comes here? With some of us, we don't even know. Or even walking long distances. And even if we look at Musa alayhi salam, all of these things, we have to wonder, why is it Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put him in those situations? Like Nuh alayhi salam, it's very clear that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put him in those situations because he would be a da'i. He would call others to Islam. If we look at Ibrahim alayhi salam, it's very easy to see that all of the difficulties that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put him in is so that he would be a good father. And when we look at Musa alayhi salam, what were the difficulties and the things that he was raised for and he was put in? Why was that? So he would be a good leader. And we find this time and time again. That understanding how to carry ourselves, understanding how to speak, understanding how to interact with others, understanding humility, this is a characteristic of a leader, and this is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had always intended for him. So even when he was kicked out, what did he do? He went and he was patient, subhanAllah. Even when we find Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talking about him, he went out, he left. And he was standing up for justice, right? That's what he was doing. He saw one of his brothers being oppressed by the Egyptians, and what did he do? He struck him. He hit him. Because he saw an injustice, and he wanted to do something about it. Because this is how he was raised. He was raised to be upright. He was raised to be strong. He was raised to be outspoken. All characteristics of a leader. And then when he knew what the repercussions would be, right? He didn't wait. The moment he was called out and said, "Oh, are you going to hit me like you hit that guy yesterday?" Musa knew immediately. He didn't wait around. Why? Because he knew Fir'aun. He knew Pharaoh. He's like, yeah, this is not going to go over well. If I stick around, it's going to be problems. So look at the intelligence and understanding and quick thinking. So what did he do? He left. He left. He saw a place where people were gathering. He said, this is a good place for me to observe. And that's exactly what he did. And it's amazing, of all the things that stuck out to him, and the things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala pointed to us, in the lesson of the story, what did he see? Again, the first thing that caught his eye was oppression. SubhanAllah. And he saw these two women, they were waiting. Out of all the things that he could have seen, right? He could have looked to say, okay, who amongst these people looks wealthy? Who amongst these people looks like they have hired hands? Who amongst these people look like they have the most influence? That's not the thing that caught his eye. The thing that caught his eye were these two women that had separated themselves waiting to get water. So he goes and he helps them. And what does he do? He goes back under the tree. And he sits and he waits again. Say, okay, maybe Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will open another opportunity for me. So he does that. And then these young women, they come back. And they say, our father would like to speak to you. And he goes and he meets the father. He sits down with him. And Shu'aib, the father, he offers to Musa alayhi salam, saying that, listen, you can marry one of my daughters, but you have to work for me for X amount of time. So he does. And this is also part of that training for leadership. If you don't know how your constituents and how the people who are doing labor, how they're living and how they're surviving, there's no way for us to understand on how this group of people works and survives and what their day-to-day is like. SubhanAllah. You just look at these experiences and how they trained him. And look at the adversity Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put him through. And we don't have anything in the verses that tell us that Musa was complaining. He was like, oh man, this is terrible. Oh man, I used to live in the palace, right? I used to have servants bring me food. Man, I had the finest horses. This is how I used to spend. No. He looked at Shu'aib alayhi salam and he agreed. He said, okay. In the moment he had some independence and financial independence, what did he do? He went back to Bani Israel. Why? Because he never forgot the oppression. And if we look time and time and time and time again at the life of Musa alayhi salam, his goal and his hadaf was to fight oppression. He couldn't stand that people were being oppressed. He couldn't tolerate it. He had to do something about it. And we find, again, that he would only do something about it when he felt like he had the position and the power and the authority and the ability to do it. He wouldn't jump immediately, right? He wasn't emotional. That, oh, this is how you do it. No. It was actually very calculated. If we look at his life, it is actually very calculated. And then he returns back to Bani Israel. And he says, no, we're leaving. We're not staying here. Allah has commanded me, Allah has told me, we're leaving. And if they could have left before, I'm sure they would have. But now they have somebody, and why did they listen to him? Again, somebody who's well-spoken. Somebody who's graceful. Somebody who can speak to others and understand the plights and the problems and the difficulties that people face. The true characteristics of a leader. So we need to look at ourselves. And we need to look at our children. What kind of characteristics of leadership are we learning and we taking, and what kind of characteristics are we instilling in our children and instilling others? May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us tawfiq. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. والصلاة والسلام على سيد الأنبياء والمرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين ما بعد. يقول الله عز وجل: وإذ قال موسى لقومه يا قوم اذكروا نعمة الله عليكم إذ جعل فيكم أنبياء وجعلكم ملوكا وآتاكم ما لم يؤت أحدا من العالمين. That Musa said to his people, my people, remember Allah's blessings on you. How He raised prophets among you and appointed kings for you and gave you what He had not given to any other people. So even after this victory, even after moving, even after leaving, even after these successes, He wants to make sure that, listen, now that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given you authority, now that He has given you power, there is a chance that the moment somebody is given power and authority, that they will oppress others. Remember where you came from. Remember your background. Remember the difficulties that you faced. And this is a huge lesson for us. That we have to remember where we came from. We have to remember the difficulties that we faced. Because if we look at the time when we didn't have, it helps us appreciate the time when we do. Our entire lives, the entirety of them, is between qabd wa bast. The entirety of our life is between when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decides to give and when He decides to take away. So we need to look at the times when we didn't have. We need to look at the times when we were hungry. We need to look at the times when we didn't have money in our account. We need to look at the times where we were in the cold because we couldn't turn the heat up. We need to look at the times where we had to turn the fan on because we couldn't afford the AC. We need to look at the times where we were making dua that the car would make it to the destination because the needle is already on E. Those are the times we need to remember. Because it allows us that when we sit in our cars now and we see it on F, how much more comfortable we feel. Or those times where we can comfortably get in the car and we know that it will start without worrying on, man, will the car work today, will it not work today? Or we can walk in the house and the house is warm. Where we walk in the house and we smell food. We cannot appreciate those things until we remember when we didn't have them. And maybe, just maybe, this is why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala took everything away from Musa. When He gave him power, He gave him status, He gave him servants, He gave him the best food, He gave him the best training, He gave him the best company, and then Allah took all that away. Why? So that Musa alayhi salam would appreciate it. And if we look in this last ayah that we recited, that's exactly what He wants, the message that He wants to pass down to Bani Israel. That you were slaves, you were owned, you were oppressed, you were killed, you were taken advantage of. Don't forget that. Because if you forget that, then you will do the same thing to others. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us from those who prevent oppression. Make us from those who fight oppression. Make us from those who do not allow ourselves to be oppressed. I ask Allah Azza wa Jal to have mercy and to right those of our brothers and sisters in Palestine who have passed amongst the shuhada. I ask Allah Azza wa Jal to have mercy on all of those who have passed. I ask Him Azza wa Jal to give shifa, to give healing to all of those who are ill. I ask Him Azza wa Jal to help those who are in any type of financial difficulty out of that difficulty. And I ask Him Azza wa Jal to help those who are in debt out of that debt. And I ask Him Azza wa Jal to gather us in His paradise. Wa aqimus salah.